Did you list your role as a student? I'm always surprised when students don't list this first and foremost. Isn't that part of the defining feature of where you are right now in your life? Probably. Part of life is facing and solving many problems. When looking at the word problem, you might think of the current COVID-19 virus situation. And it indeed is a serious problem, both individual, family, societal, and world. We have faced as human species much bigger viral attacks or epidemics than this one. For example, to maybe give us a historical perspective, the Black Plague taking place in the middle 1300s killed 50 million people. That was 60% of all Europeans. If you consider more modern times, the Great Influenza outbreak of 1918, it killed 1/5 of the entire world's population. That was significantly more than died in World War I. Humans have faced many viruses in the past, and the coronavirus has a mortality rate of about 1%, which means we should take all proper steps, including social distancing of 6 feet and vigorous hand washing. But to keep in historical perspective, it is a virus that is actually not nearly as significant or severe, at least biologically, than the ones we have faced as a species before. I don't know if that helps at all, but I just wanted to share that little bit of information that I learned myself. Let's focus on problem-solving strategies. On this slide, we're going to look at 3 different strategies, that of trial and error, algorithms, and heuristics. Trial and error is sometimes the best strategy to go. Looking at the picture at the right of the keys, let's say that you're trying to find a particular key and you don't know which one. Well, try one. If that works, great. Try the next one. And keep going until you either solve it or you give up. Sometimes that is the best way to go. Now, algorithms, on the other hand, are very different. As you can see, there are a series of steps which are guaranteed to get you to a correct solution. In class, I ask students, if I give them the word algorithm, what does it make them think of, what particular academic area? And they'll often say math or computers. Exactly, because algorithms are used in both of those disciplines. So if a computer is given a correct algorithm, as long as there is an answer out there, the computer will solve it. So they guarantee a correct solution. But many times humans do not use algorithms. They take a lot more effort. As humans, we like heuristics. And maybe think of it as a mnemonic, H is for human, H is heuristic. So you don't get the term algorithm mixed up with heuristic. Heuristics usually work. There's what's worked in the past, shortcuts, rules of thumb. So if they work quickly, but they don't always work. On the next slide will be just 3 examples, and see if you can figure out which is example of the trial and error strategy, the algorithm, and the heuristic. I think you'll do it very easily. So first, reading the manual, definitely an example of using an algorithm. It will work as long as you read it properly and apply it. In class, I always ask my students, which of you always use the manual? And usually I get 1 or 2, 3 students will raise their hand. The rest of us often try to avoid manuals whenever possible. I ask those 2 or 3 or 4 students to share why they use manuals. Fire technology and aviation students often give me a similar answer. It could be the difference between life and death. A second example, that would definitely be trial and error. And the third one, definitely an example of a very human way of doing it, the heuristic. Go ahead and jot these 4 different types of heuristics into your notes, and on the next slides we'll be talking about them individually. Let's consider the heuristic of working backwards. Let's pretend that you have a task that is overwhelming you with anxiety, maybe the construction of a paper for a particular teacher, and you can't get yourself started. Well, maybe picture the task from the back moving forward. Perhaps the last thing you would do would be to do your reference page. And if you have your sources at this point and a format guide, well then go ahead and construct a reference page. You now have the last task done, and you probably could feel your anxiety levels drop precipitously. When I always did a paper, the second to the last thing I did was the title page. So maybe do your title page. And again, you can maybe feel your anxiety drop a little bit more. So either by doing the task backwards or even visualizing it backwards, you might get that certain task started. So if you mentally yelled out to the previous slide, life is like a box of chocolate, indeed, a famous quote, or indeed a famous metaphor, made even more famous by Forrest Gump. Sometimes using metaphors will help to clarify your thinking. If you were confused and thought, well, isn't that a simile? Well, you are right. It is both a simile and a metaphor. Similes are subtypes of metaphors. Similes will use the word like. Life is like a box of chocolate. Metaphors and simile are both comparisons, but a metaphor does not use necessarily the word like. Consider the famous Shakespearean quote, "All the world is a stage, and the men and women are merely players." So that's also comparing men and women to being on a stage. Life basically is like a stage, though it did not use the word like. And if you want to make this a little bit more complex, analogies are in the same ballpark, and many students and faculty get similes and metaphors and analogies mixed up. Analogies take it further. Analogies want to explain, and analogies want to apply. Maybe even as a mnemonic, think of as analogies want to analyze. For example, if you're told, stop beating a dead horse, it is suggested that you apply that and stop your particular labors on a situation. It is not going to be fruitful. Or consider another famous analogy. No sense rearranging your chairs on the Titanic, meaning, again, future work in this area is not going to yield any fruitful gain, suggesting that you apply that and ceasing your behavior. So maybe that's also clarified, metaphor, simile, and analogy. And could I ask that on a test? Well, probably, so quite probably. Another useful heuristic is breaking a big problem into smaller problems. So a student facing a report card, though we don't call that anymore. Another heuristic for solving problems would be breaking the problem into smaller problems. Let's say that a student at the midterm grade point is noting difficulties in all or most of their classes. So instead of looking at the big problem of unsuccessful performance, maybe break it into individual ones, each specific area, and tackle from there. So perhaps a student would next contact individual teachers who are still available over the break, contact success coaches who are also still available over the break, and so on. So many times a big overwhelming problem is much more tackleable, if that's a word, by breaking into smaller tasks that can be successfully challenged. So a very effective heuristic can be breaking a big problem into smaller ones. So if you're doing poorly in all your classes, look at each individually and go from there. So look at the syllabus, look at if you're completing the assignments on time. If you are, talk to each teacher, talk to the success coaches. So you might need to make different adjustments in different classes, but this problem at first class, which might be insurmountable, might be quite tackleable. But don't wait to midterms. As soon as you have trouble in any class, get help at that point. We're all here to help you, and we all want you to succeed. I'm sure you either thought yourself COVID-19 or its alternate name, the coronavirus. Last year, of course, we did not hear that example. Last year, HIV was a very common example. Computer viruses, such as maybe the Trojan, or the virus shown in that poor baby in the bottom right. Do you remember what virus that would be? That would be the Zika virus. So in this task, you're asked to list the first virus that came to your mind. You are actually using one of our heuristics on our first PowerPoint. That was the availability heuristic. So again, the availability heuristic is just choosing whatever answer, whatever choice comes to your mind first. So if you mentally yelled out to the previous slide, life is like a box of chocolate, indeed, a famous quote, or indeed a famous metaphor, made even more famous by Forrest Gump. Sometimes using metaphors will help to clarify your thinking. If you're confused and thought, well, isn't that a simile? Well, you are right. It is both a simile and a metaphor. Similes are subtypes of metaphors. Similes will use the word like. Life is like a box of chocolate. Metaphors and simile are both comparisons, but a metaphor does not use necessarily the word like. Consider the famous Shakespearean quote, "All the world is a stage, and the men and women are merely players." So that's also comparing men and women to being on a stage. Life basically is like a stage, though it did not use the word like. If you want to make this a little bit more complex, analogies are in the same ballpark, and many students and faculty get similes and metaphors and analogies mixed up. Analogies take it further. Analogies want to explain, and analogies want to apply. Maybe even as a mnemonic, think of as analogies want to analyze. For example, if you're told, stop beating a dead horse, it is suggested that you apply that and stop your particular labors on a situation. It is not going to be fruitful. Or consider another famous analogy. No sense rearranging your chairs on the Titanic, meaning, again, future work in this area is not going to yield any fruitful gain, suggesting that you apply that and ceasing your behavior. So maybe that's also clarified metaphor, simile, and analogy. And could I ask that on a test? Well, probably. So quite probably. In thinking, we use prototypes, exemplars, and stereotypes. A prototype is the best example of something. So if I ask you regarding apples, not your favorite type, but which apple captures appleness the best, which is the appliest of all apples, a student might say Red Delicious or Granny Smith. Whatever you think is the best example of a certain category is a prototype. Well, let's consider dogs. If I'd ask you not what type of dog you own or what dog you prefer, but what dog captures dogitude the best, some students will say German Shepherds or Pit Bulls, which would be the best answer, by the way, or Chihuahuas or Shelties. Whatever you say would be your prototype. Now, when you're done with the slide, look at the dog on the next slide. I have never had a student list this particular dog as their prototype. And yes, the hair naturally goes that way, and this is actually a very good quality one of this particular breed. Do you know this breed? Probably not. You'll see a Chinese crested on the next slide. The word exemplar is just a fancy term for the word example. So if your prototype dog was a German Shepherd, and if you were in class, the person next to you had said Chihuahua, and the person on the other side of them said Beagle, their answers for you would have been exemplars. Now, in thinking, sometimes we'll also use stereotypes. Stereotypes allow for quick, easy thinking, but risk being inaccurate. I wanted to first tackle a stereotype that applies to dogs. For example, the dog stereotype, most pit bulls are dangerous. So when asked what dog is the doggiest of all dogs, in your personal opinion, not the dog that you own or the dog that you want to own, but the dog that best exemplifies dogitude the best, in other words, we're asking you for a prototype. And this little guy probably is not going to come to very many people's example of the dog prototype. Do you have any idea what type of dog this is? And the hair growth that you see, the lack of coat on the body, the long, luxurious hair in the mane and lower legs. I did have one student once who did know it. This is a Chinese crested. It's a breed I find very interesting, but I would not want to own. They're very high maintenance. You have to have coats and even moderately cool weather, sunscreen, and so on. But again, back to our example, probably not your example of a dog prototype. Chances are, though, for many of you, one of the dogs on the next slide could be your prototype example. Unless you said a pit bull or a Jack Russell or a golden retriever, these would be exemplars. of dogs. Now let's continue with the stereotype that most pit bulls are dangerous. I'm not sure if you're familiar with human face transplants, but there have been a few. The first woman to ever have a face transplant has in a very bad stretch in her life, and she decided to commit suicide. She decided to take pills. But after she became unconscious, she was awoken by the extreme pain that she was in. Her dog, for some unknown reason, decided to literally eat her face. When she reached medical help, she was missing her nose fully and most of her lips. If you're going to look at stereotypes, which of these four breeds would you think would be the most likely to have been the doer of this dastardly deed? Would it be the pit bull, the yellow lab, the German shepherd, or maybe a Rottie? Now, as you might suspect, it would be the animal probably least likely in this grouping to be picked, the yellow lab. Now, if you're curious to see what this woman looked like, there's some pictures of her on the next slide. The first picture is when she's had many surgeries and her face is looking much more normal. On the right, her face looks, I think, very excellent considering the degree of injury. If you want to see how bad it was originally, you can go ahead and look around the internet, but the original pictures immediately afterwards were extremely graphic, and I would not necessarily recommend them. So to conclude, if you utilize a stereotype, the stereotype, as it often does in life, would lead you to an incorrect answer. Let's consider people by some of the many categories we place them in: race, ethnicity, sex, age, religious status, sexual orientation, and maybe student status. For each one of these, starting with race and ethnicity, pick a race or ethnicity which you consider to be very different than yours. And think of some statements that you might apply, see as commonalities of people in that other racial or ethnic group. Go ahead and do it, it's not harmful. Next, picture a person of a different sex group, male, female, transgender, but picture a different sex and some commonalities that would go in that particular sexual group. Focus on, if you will, behavioral or psychological. Next, for age, pick an age group very different than yours and think of some commonalities that people in that age group share psychologically or intellectually, behaviorally. Next, pick a religion very different than yours, or if you're not religious, pick a religious group and think of some commonalities of people in that particular religious group. Next, pick a sexual orientation that's different than yours. Again, think of some commonalities of people in that particular group. So I'm asking you to basically engage in stereotyping. Now let's look in the group that we're all a member of this class, except perhaps myself. Think of statements that people that are not students often think that all students share or most students share. How well do these statements fit you? Probably not all that well. So we do have a tendency as humans to engage in stereotyping. And as we probably don't want it done to us, we should probably avoid doing it to other groups. People who are the heaviest users of stereotypes tend to believe that there's far more variability in their group than members of other groups. Let's consider people by some of the many categories we place them in: race, ethnicity, sex, age, religious status, sexual orientation, and maybe student status. For each one of these, starting with race and ethnicity, pick a race or ethnicity which you consider to be very different than yours. And think of some statements that you might apply, see as commonalities of people in that other racial or ethnic group. Go ahead and do it, it's not harmful. Next, picture a person of a different sex group, male, female, transgender, but picture a different sex and some commonalities that would go in that particular sexual group. Focus on, if you will, behavioral or psychological. Next, for age, Pick an age group very different than yours and think of some commonalities that people in that age group share psychologically or intellectually, behaviorally. Next, pick a religion very different than yours, or if you're not religious, pick a religious group and think of some commonalities of people in that particular religious group. Next, pick a sexual orientation that's different than yours. Again, think of some commonalities of people in that particular group. So I'm asking you to basically engage in stereotyping. Now let's look in the group that we're all a member of this class, except perhaps myself. Think of statements that people that are not students often think that all students share or most students share. How well do these statements fit you? Probably not all that well. So we do have a tendency as humans to engage in stereotyping. And as we probably don't want it done to us, we should probably avoid doing it to other groups. People who are the heaviest users of stereotypes tend to believe that there's far more variability in their group than members of other groups. People that endorse stereotypes are more likely to be prejudiced, that is, to harbor negative beliefs regarding certain groups. And unfortunately, prejudice may be transformed into differential behaviors. In other words, prejudice can lead to discrimination. In the last few years, there's been a dramatic increase in discrimination and in particular hate crimes against various groups of Americans. Allies are needed. Unfortunately, it is not difficult to find examples of discrimination leading to violence. This particular picture is from the Tree of Life Temple, which was the site of a shooting. The perpetrator, shown on the right, shot a total of 11 people and wounded 6. Unfortunately, it was not difficult to find images of hate crimes. This particular picture was taken from the Tree of Life Temple. It was the site of a mass shooting back in 2018. 11 people were killed and 6 were wounded. The perpetrator, shown on the right, was Robert Bowers. Unfortunately, it is not a difficult task to find pictures of hate crimes. The picture shown is the Tree of Life Temple, which is the site of a mass shooting in 2018. The perpetrator, shown on the right, Robert Bowers, killed 11 people and wounded 6 others. Currently, hate crimes of the most violent nature are increasing and are currently at a 27-year high. Unfortunately, it is not a difficult task to find pictures from mass shootings. The picture shown is from the Tree of Life Synagogue. The perpetrator, Robert Bowers on the right, shot 6 people and killed 11 more. Oh, God. Unfortunately, it is an easy task to find pictures of hate crimes. Shown is a picture of the Tree of Life Synagogue, the site of a mass shooting. The perpetrator on the right, Robert Bowers, killed 11 people and wounded additional 6 more. Currently, violent hate crimes are at a 27-year high. Unfortunately, it is an easy task to find pictures for mass shootings. Shown is the Tree of Life Synagogue, the site of a mass shooting in which 11 people were killed and 6 were wounded. The perpetrator, Robert Bowers, is shown on the right. Currently, violent hate crimes are at a 27-year high. Let's now consider that very important type of thinking called critical thinking, evaluating the information to reach reasonable conclusions based on evidence. So first we have to look at the source of the information and the quality of the information itself. If you find the source to be utterly unreliable, stop there. You might consider a fact-checking website such as factcheck.org or Snopes. These are amongst the well-reputed fact-checkers. So next step, examine the information and draw reasonable conclusions. And the last part is the painful part sometimes. Sometimes we have to change our thinking if it's refuted by evidence. And that is the hallmark of critical thinking. And let's continue to the next slide, which is going to have us actually go to a fact check website and learn a little bit more. In the previous slide, we identified steps for critical thinking, but how does one evaluate a source, and how does one evaluate this information, especially in this age of internet information and Facebook information? For this activity, you will be visiting two different websites. The first would be the factcheck.org. This is associated with the Annenberg Policy Institute, and the Phil Zimbardo video clips that we've been watching were all produced by Annenberg. It's highly regarded in the academic world. Now, when you're done listening to this particular narration of the slide, you'll actually go to this website. You'll probably have pulled out the questions that you'll need from your weekly attendance/policy quiz, and that's great, you'll get the answers. But also take notes on this entire video clip, put it into your notebook. Do expect on test number 2 that you will see a question based on this particular content, and it will not necessarily be the same one that you're answering for the weekly quiz here, the weekly participation. This is a hint. You will need to write them down in your notes and study them, because you will expect and you will see a question on it. Now, after you finish with the fact check website, you'll be going on to Snopes, and you'll also be getting a question answered probably for your participation/weekly quiz. So let's say that you in real life are checking out some sort of claim on Facebook or the internet. You've now checked it and you found it to be actually accurate. The third step would be to go ahead and to process that information. And sometimes in part of this processing, you must actually realize that your belief system had some inaccuracies, and you might actually have to change your belief system to accommodate facts. It's painful, but hopefully you want your belief system based on reality rather than just the way you wish or thought the world was. Let's now turn our focus to the study of intelligence. Believe it or not, this is one of the most controversial areas of psychology. What is intelligence? Can it be accurately measured, and should it be accurately measured? We'll start by trying to define it. Unlike other chapters in this course in which I gave you one definition of intelligence, there is no agreed upon a definition, so we're going to turn to a few of the experts and see how they define intelligence. Let's start with the viewpoint of Robert Sternberg and his triarchic or triarchical theory of intelligence. As you might want to indeed logically guess, it has a three-part component to it. Practical, what to do in day-to-day living when problems arise. Analytical, think of it as logic. Creative, you might think creativity is a gift. He considers it to be a full-fledged area of intelligence. As we're seeing, there is not one unified theory of intelligence. Sternberg is offered us a very popular and well-regarded theory. Another very well-regarded and popular theory of intelligence is Raymond Cattell's view of intelligence. We'll also learn about Raymond Cattell's view of personality, which is also equally esteemed by psychologists. He looks at intelligence as having two distinct components, that of fluid and crystallized. Fluid involves how you think, the different types of thinking, which would definitely include critical thinking, as well as inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, and analyze mathematical properties of things, and so on. Abstract thinking. This contrasts to crystallized thinking, more specifically crystallized intelligence, which refers to facts. So maybe as a mnemonic, think of a crystal necklace, maybe big quartz crystal, so it's unisex, so everybody can wear it. And every crystal represents a specific area of knowledge. So maybe your crystal for intelligence of music is huge because you know a lot about music. Maybe your crystal intelligence about cooking is very small, or vice versa. But anyway, crystallized intelligence represents the various facts, the bits of knowledge. Cattell's view is very popular amongst developmental psychologists because these two different types of intelligence change very differently as we age. So a very useful theory to psychologists and gerontologists. Let's next consider Howard Gardner and his 7 areas of multiple intelligences. Though his recent work has focused on 9, we'll focus on his basic 7. One area is linguistic. You can call it verbal if you wish. Let's say that a teacher wants to measure her students' or his students' linguistic intelligence. Could you try to think of a couple different ways that the teacher could measure this? Perhaps you said vocabulary, perhaps reading speed, which is not the same thing as reading comprehension. If you can speak more than one language, you might say being fluent in many languages. Be able to public speak, be able to write an effective essay. These would be all legitimate ways of measuring linguistic intelligence. Logic and math, spatial. For a moment, consider which side of the brain was spatially oriented. Was it the left or right? Hopefully you said right. Remember our mnemonic for the left, language, logical, linear. So spatial. So be able to draw a map or read a map, drawing in general. To picture the layout of something in your mind. To picture how to go from here to there in your mind. To recognize a face, or read a dog or type a car. These are all spatial tasks. Next, musical. Let's say a teacher wishes to measure his or her student's musical ability. Think of a few different ways, if you will, please, how to do that. If you play an instrument, you certainly put that on your list. Perhaps to be able to sing in tune. Perhaps to read music. Perhaps to be versed in many musical genres. To that end, I've attached either a website address for you to look up or the couple words to put in your search engine. Please humor your teacher and do it. You might find it interesting. Bodily kinesthetic, one of our senses, the ability to use the body skillfully. Think of a few occupations, if you will, that require very considerable bodily kinesthetic intelligence. Perhaps you're thinking of a sports area. Absolutely. Maybe a surgeon. Maybe a craftsperson who uses their hands extensively. Next two, we'll tackle them at the same time. Think of what intra means and what inter means. Intra, perhaps like intrastate commerce or intramural sports. Intra means within, so that would be self-knowledge. Do you know yourself? Do you learn from your mistakes? Do you know what your directions in life, and so on? Inter, like intramural sports or interstate commerce, means between, focuses on your knowledge of others. Can you understand others? Can you predict others? Can you influence others? If I were able to teach this lecture in class, we would be next doing an activity. The next slide, we will see the activity that I would have students do. I'd ask you to do it on your own privately. And then after you do each task, see if you can identify which area of intelligence it was designed to reflect. I hope you actually took the time to do these items. It can be fun, and it will actually help you to remember the items should they be asked on the test. Number 1 was obviously musical. Number 2, obviously linguistic, but did you translate the sentences? A, can't teach a new trick to an old dog. B, all that glitters is not gold. C, too many cooks spoil the broth. Remember learning that as a story as a child? A mother asked, with a very large family, asked one of her children to throw salt into the soup. They were too busy. The next child, she asked the same thing, and the next thing through the entire large family of children. At the end, they all felt guilty, and one by one threw salt in the soup, and salt and salt and more salt, to the end point that their dinner was inedible. Hence, too many cooks spoil the broth. D, well, scintillate means twinkle. So twinkle, twinkle, little star. 3, you're rotating your paper. Now you see the letters I love psychology upside down, and you're going to write them upside down as you see them. a difficult task if you do that correctly, and that would be spatial. 4, you probably know that you have a handedness, but you also have an eye preference. For example, if given a microscope or a telescope, you'll almost always use the same eye. You also have a foot preference. For example, if we roll a kickball at you. Anyway, this would be bodily kinesthetic. Number 5, getting at self-knowledge. In other words, intrapersonal knowledge. 6, obviously the math of math and logic. To calculate the mean, you add them up and divide by 5. To calculate the mode, you just find out what numbers appear the most often. Most sets have just one mode. This set is bimodal with an 8 and 10. And median, very useful because it's not affected by extreme high or low scores. The median would be the middle number, but after you put them in order. And after you put them in order, the 9 would be the median score. 7, trying to get a give and take between two people, trying to strive for interpersonal knowledge. At least that was my hope. I hope you enjoy doing this activity. A picture in the days before OSHA regulated the safety of job sites. There is no net. If these men fall, they are dead. What type of intelligences must these men excel at? Take a moment and think of Gardner's 7 areas. Oh, really do it. I'm going to give you time to do it. If you say spatial, I would have to agree, but also bodily kinesthetic, though perhaps even a little bit of interpersonal. You certainly don't want to anger the person next to you. You might remember early in the course when we were looking at the approaches to psychology, one approach was a sociocultural approach. Well, let's approach the study of intelligence from that viewpoint now. I chose this particular picture because it suggests a lifestyle and maybe a way of viewing the world that might be quite different than our own. These people live in the rainforests of Brazil, and they're the native people of that area. Let's consider intelligence from an African point of view. Now, certainly there is no African one point of view. There are over 3,000 different tribes in Africa. We're just going to look at 3. Let's consider rural Kenya. To them, the intelligent man, woman, or child is someone who excels in practical intelligence. What do you do when this particular problem arises? So they would not necessarily be at all impressed by a person who does well, say, on a test in school. In Uganda, they value a very slow, thoughtful response, so they would not be impressed by the student who instantly pops up their hand to answer a question. Indeed, that student would be seen as lacking. In Nigeria, the intelligent man, woman, or child displays very good social skills as well as a very good memory. So if you or a friend of yours might be very absent-minded in Nigeria, that would be a sure sign of lacking intelligence. Likewise, a person that's particularly rude, a person that therefore is lacking in good social skills, in our estimation is probably just rude, but again, in Nigeria, that person would be demonstrating poor intelligence. If we were to generalize about how intelligence is viewed across many Asian cultures, one commonality is that there's a recognition that the intelligent man, woman, or child is able to both recognize and accept contradictions. So if you rail against contradictions in your life, if you like things better simple than complex, well, that might be a sign of lower intelligence, at least in some Asian cultures. Let's now turn and see how intelligence is viewed by Native American cultures. In the United States alone, there are 565 recognized Native American cultures, and therefore 565 viewpoints on intelligence. We're just picking out 3. A common theme which is often seen is working together and not competing, working for the good of the group. So if you got the highest test score, excellent, but from a Native American point of view, what did you do to help your classmates? What did you do to help the entire group? If you didn't, you would not necessarily at all be seen as the most intelligent person in that particular class. Being respectful, well, we saw this viewpoint in African cultures too. So a person who is very rude is not only very rude, but showing a distinct lack of intelligence. The third one I find to be very interesting, at least from a non-Native American perspective, not acting white. And if you're not a person that is classified as white, you can still, unfortunately, act white here. White is seen as acting in ways that are against the group, against the environment, against Mother Nature. So acting in ways to destroy community, acting in ways to put oneself above the good of the environment, that was what they mean by acting white. And sadly, unfortunately, everybody can act white. We will now take a very brief but very interesting look at animal intelligence, a topic I find particularly interesting, and I hope you do too. Let's start our look at animal intelligence by looking at the dog. This particular breed of dog is often considered to be the smartest of breeds. Do you recognize him? He'd be a herding variety if that helps. He would be a border collie. Chaser is perhaps the smartest dog. At the time this book was written, his vocabulary was at 1,000 words that he could distinctly recognize and make specific behaviors in reaction to. Very impressive. Now, if somebody makes a comment to you and refers to you as a bird brain, you would probably be very insulted, but maybe you should not be. Let's consider these two birds, often considered to be the geniuses of the bird kingdom. Both of these animals are involved in research. The bird on the left is a crow and is solving a dilemma that many humans could not successfully meet. You can see the tube there. A desirable food item is floating the top beyond the bird's reach. How can the bird solve it? You can see the objects on the platform. The bird, if it is smart enough, will pick up the object, drop it into the water, pushing the water upwards, rather like Archimedes' discovery in the bathtub. And this crow was actually able to solve the problem that not all humans would. The bird on the right, an African gray parrot, is responding to a verbal command, and I really can't tell you specifically the command asked to give me the color green or give me the number 2, but the African gray has been used extensively in both intelligence and language research. Next, let's consider our closest relative, the chimpanzee, studied extensively by Jane Goodall. When Jane Goodall began her research, she was a very young woman, similar to the age of many of my students. Jane observed in the wild chimpanzees making and using simple tools. She wrote up her observation and submitted it, and it was published in journals, and it caused a great outcry. It was claimed by her fellow scientists that either she was flat out lying or that she was actually teaching them how to do it. But her research was later replicated in other chimpanzee groups. The tool probably would not impress you very much. She saw them take a stick, twig of grass in other words, strip off the leaves, now that it was smooth, insert it into the holes of the termite mound, and pull it out, and many ants or termites would be attached to it, defending their colonies, that is, and the chimpanzee would have a popsicle stick of ants or termites, which to chimpanzees, I guess, is quite the treat. So it's a very simple tool, but nonetheless, it is a tool made by a non-human. This puts the chimpanzee in a very unique status with them and ourselves. Language abilities have also been extensively studied in the chimpanzee. Early studies focused on vocal language, but due to the design of the chimpanzee mouth and throat, chimpanzees are not able to make all human vowel sounds and are extremely limited in their ability to say words. A chimpanzee was able to learn a couple of words, including the word cup, but it came from deep in the animal's throat and didn't sound remotely human. Researchers realized the problem wasn't necessarily chimpanzee intelligence as much as throat and mouth, and moved into other mediums, including sign language. This is NIM, one of the early sign language using chimps. Another one was named after a county in Nevada. His name was Washoe. It appears that these chimpanzees may have been able to learn sign language. A very prominent psychologist critiqued their research and said they were just parroting the symbols, pairing the signs and not using them as truly language. His name was Herbert Terence, and many people that do study chimpanzee language do believe that his perspective and that they're not truly learning language, just sadly, instead of just mimicking hand signs that have just been used. Next, let's take a look at intelligence and language ability in the gorilla. You probably recognize Coco. Do you know the name of her trainer? Petty Patterson. What impresses me most about Coco is not necessarily her signing ability, but also her very human ability to both lie and swear. For example, you can see her beloved kitty. One day, Coco, being a kind of big girl, apparently broke her toilet. When Penny inquired how the toilet had become broken, how do you think she explained the broken toilet? No, she did not say that she didn't know. She blamed it on somebody else. Indeed, she blamed it on the kitten. So not a very good lie, but still capable of formulating a lie. Also impressive in my mind is swearing. When she becomes frustrated, she swears at Penny. Now, Penny did not teach her swear words, so Coco had to choose from amongst the vocabulary that she was given, and apparently the dirtiest, nastiest thing that she can think of is the toilet. So when she gets frustrated with Penny, she calls her a very, very dirty toilet, dirty, very, just repeats those words. Again, not showing grammar, but showing a mastery of the concepts of the words. I am going to try to include a link here. It is a very sad link. I don't know if you want to see it. It shows you when the gorilla recognized and she was told that her beloved kitty had died due to a traffic accident. So view that or not, that's your own choice. Let's consider IQ. In order to do the extremes, we have to know what the average is first. Do you know the average IQ? Think for a moment. 75? No, that's actually called borderline, almost intellectually disabled. The most average IQ would be 100. Given an intellectual disability would be the top and bottom 2% of the bell curve. So flip to the next page when you're done listening and write in the cutoff for giftedness and the cutoff for disability. To fill in the slide, I'm going to ask you to go to the website address listed and view part of the clip there. If you want to skim in the beginning, stop when you see the art showing a Chinese gentleman. It'll be a painting. Start playing at that point. You'll then see the gentleman on the right bottom of the screen who invented the first IQ test. You also see a picture of his family with him. Continue to play until they start discussing Terman. Once they're just done discussing Terman, you can skip out of the clip, but if you're enjoying it, by all means continue watching it. At that point, please go back and fill in the slide. To fill in the slide, I'm going to ask you to go to the website address listed and view part of the clip there. If you want to skim in the beginning, stop when you see the art showing a Chinese gentleman. It'll be a painting. Start playing at that point. You'll then see the gentleman on the right bottom of the screen who invented the first IQ test. You also see a picture of his family with him. Continue to play until they start discussing Terman. Once they're just done discussing Terman, you can skip out of the clip, but if you're enjoying it, by all means continue watching it. At that point, please go back and fill in the slide. This figure is a bell curve showing the frequency of different IQ scores in humans. The peak of the curve, the most common IQ score, the mean, mode, median, would be 100. You can see the percent of people falling within 1, 2, or 3 standard deviations from the mean. You can see that people in the very tail end of the curve, the highest 2% or the lowest 2%, are outliers. So depending on the particular theoretician, the bottom 2 or 1% would be people that are labeled nowadays mentally disabled. When this curve was designed, the term was mental retardation. And you can see the top 1 or 2% of people with IQ scores in the highest range, the gifted individuals, their scores would be 130 or greater. So the previous slide, if you're trying to figure out how to spell the two gentlemen's names, well, they're above for you. The names are Simon and Benet. Theophile if you care about first name, and Alfred for Benet if you care. I particularly don't. In the slide, you'll see some of the questions that were found on the original IQ test. In terms of the other blank, what does IQ stand for? IQ stands for intelligence quotient. Q-U-O-T-I-E-N-T. Let's now consider one cause of intellectual disability, that of Down syndrome. Please look at all the captions in blue and fill in as many as you can based on your own knowledge. Now let's recover it starting from the beginning. Down syndrome is also called trisomy 21. Now somy, S-O-M-Y, is rather like soma. So basically you got 3 in body, telling you that in the cells of the individual's body, instead of having the typical number of 21st chromosomes, that is a pair, they have tri. They have 3 number 21 chromosomes. So if they have 3, how many chromosomes do they have in each cell? Well, they'd have that one extra, that making the third, so they would have, instead of 46, they would have 47. Its causes, therefore, are reflected in the scientific name, having an extra 21st chromosome, typically in every body cell. Risk factors would be age of mom. Apparently not age of dad. Older dads are far more likely to have autistic spectrum children, though. Let me give you 3 numbers that might surprise you in terms of how strongly age is related as a risk. Women that are with Down syndrome babies are often older women. At 30, her risk would be very low. About 1 in 1,000 babies would be conceived that have Down syndrome. So 1 in 1,000 at 30, very low risk. At 40, it jumps very substantially to 1 in 100, give or take. At mid to upper 40s, jumps to 1 in 10 or 1 in 12. So very surprising how age is implicated. Physical traits, well, body shape, if you're familiar with the individual's body shape, they won't be tall and lean. They'll typically be of shorter stature and much stockier in build. They will also typically have a particular facial profile, very flat face due to extra fat in the body, including the face. The tongue would often protrude out of the mouth, or the mouth is often open. Apparently it is not due to the tongue being bigger, but the space inside the jaw being smaller. Health problems. Unfortunately, people with Downs suffer very commonly very severe health problems. Did you guess any before? Heart problems are not uncommon. Sometimes heart surgery is performed on the baby while it's still in the womb. Other significant health problems include terrible immune systems in the days pre-antibiotics and pre-vaccines for flus. They commonly died in childhood or teens. Another common health problem would be Alzheimer's. They often get Alzheimer's in their 40s and 50s. So those are some of the significant health problems that are common in the Downs population. Psychological traits, well, they are intellectually disabled in terms of intellect, so that's a cognitive aspect of the psychological traits. In terms of emotional constitution, as compared to other people that are intellectually disabled or in population in general, they tend to be as a group happier, affectionate, more cheerful. Perhaps a partial compensation to the parents. Do you know what FAS stands for? Many of my students do. Fetal alcohol syndrome. But do you know FASD? That has replaced the term FAS. That would be fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Key features would be the intellect, the child or adult will be intellectually disabled. That would reflect changes to the brain, basically malformations to the brain. Another essential feature would be that the malformations are not limited to the brain. Each individual also has individual physical issues, maybe one individual kidney issues, maybe another joint issues, maybe a third one hearing issues, and so on. So the second feature was malformations other than the brain. And a third key feature would be the face. Examine the face of these 4 children and see what do you see common across these 4 pictures. You might see that the eyes seem to be spaced further apart, and indeed they are. And they don't seem to have the glitter that children's eyes usually have, that sparkle of curiosity and intelligence. You might see that the noses seem to be flatter, and the space between the nose and the upper lip might seem to be much bigger than usual, which it is. If the nose was larger and the upper lip was bigger, then the space would be reduced. Also, that little vertical groove that just about everybody has between their nose and their upper lip, they are lacking. Prevention? Well, prevention is covered on the next slide. This slide shows you the brain of a child that died from non-FAS causes, and on the right, a brain of the same age child that died from FAS. This condition is not typically fatal, but this is just to show you the damage that can be done. If you're having trouble spelling fetal alcohol syndrome, you'll note that it's at the bottom of this particular slide. Do you recognize whose theories of intelligence is being portrayed here? Could it be Cattell or Gardner or Sternberg? Think a moment and double check your answers against the PowerPoints. So, do you recognize whose theory is being portrayed? You'll notice it has 7 different specific areas of intelligence being proposed. Could it be Simon or Binet or Stanford, maybe Guilford, maybe Gardner, maybe Sternberg, maybe Cattell? For the previous slide, hopefully you came to a conclusion it was Robert Sternberg's triaxial theory of intelligence. And for this slide, hopefully you identified Gardner's 7 or 8 or even 9 areas of specific intelligence.